Hi, I'm Dani. I'm a PhD student at Northeastern, though I'm currently living in Iowa, and I see that my video went off for some reason. It's fine. You all can see my screen, right? Yes?
Yes, and your
Okay.
video was back on and now it's not, but that's totally fine.
I'm not sure why it's not doing both, but it's fine. We'll focus on
No
the screen
worries.
for now. Okay, so this is Whose Memory, Whose Archive, the Politics of Preservation, and the Iraqi Jewish Archive, and thank you all for being here. I'm just going to get right into this topic so we have time for the discussion questions that I have towards the end here. So looking at this first slide here, just as an overview of what I wanted to go through, I'm going to give a brief overview of the Iraqi Jewish Archive, along with some historical context for it and the background of the archive itself. Um, I am leaving a little bit of time to ask questions, and if we wanted to look at the archive online, we can do that. But I did prepare some discussion questions as well that I'll share, not just the slide, but a Google Doc for us to look at. Um, Getting right into the historical context here. So the Iraqi Jewish community was one of the first diaspora communities outside of the land of Israel. Going way back in historical context here, the first mention of Israel as a people outside of the Torah was from the Merneptah Stele, which I believe was found in Egypt from 1208 BCE. And about 100 years later, we have the likely founding of the Kingdom of Israel historically. In 722 BCE, we know that the northern tribes of Israel were dispersed, and many of them were forced into what is now Iraq. And in 586, with the destruction of the first temple and the Babylonian conquest, even more Jews were forced to modern-day Iraq. Now, not all of them stayed there, but that's when we have the founding of the Iraqi Jewish community and the real expansion of it. And that is, of course, where the Babylonian Talmud was written, starting about 300 years or so after the Jerusalem Talmud was believed to have begun. In slightly more recent history, just I put a little time marker on about 650 CE, which is when we see Jews and other minorities in Muslim-controlled lands starting to um, face persecution and being given the status of dhimmi, which was protected status, though a lot of Jews from Muslim-controlled lands have noted that that protection ranged from actual protection to more of a we won't murder you, or only some of us will murder you, or there will only be some level of protection in between there. And it really depended on who was ruling and where they were. And it wasn't until roughly 1917 when the British took control of Iraq and a lot of the other territory following the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire that Jews gained a much more stable surrounding in Iraq. And so, of course, there were some communities within that space that were coexisting, and then there were others that were a lot more hostile. But when the British took control, Jews were able to get a lot more community members into things like local governments and kind of rising in the ranks of Iraqi society. And in 1932, Iraq gained independence from the British control, and there was an increasing level of anti-Jewish violence that culminated in the 1941 Farhud, which was a pogrom orchestrated in part by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who was a Nazi-aligned individual. And there were about 200 Jewish deaths and over 1,000 injuries from that. Fortunately, in 1950 and 1951, after the founding of Israel, 120,000 Jews from Iraq were brought to Israel through two different rescue missions. But in 1952, Iraq barred the remaining Jews from leaving. Unsurprisingly, there was again an increase in violence, and in 1968, public executions of Jews began, leading to increases in international pressure on Iraq. And in the 1970s, they were able to allow, or rather, more Jews were able to leave because of that pressure, though they were forced to sign over communal property. So things like the records of who had been born there, things like Torah scrolls, all of that was left in synagogues, including one prominent one in Baghdad. And in 1984, Saddam Hussein's forces took the remaining Jewish property, including what was in that synagogue. And Iraqi Jews who were still there and have since fled noted that that move was particularly made to humiliate the remaining Jews, and it was brought to a government basement. So the question then is, where did those materials end up? And nobody had really known until 2003. So in 2003, following the US invasion of Iraq, service members actually found the Iraqi Jewish archives, so all of these materials, in the basement of the Baghdad intelligence agency after it had been bombed. Sorry, my cat is scratching the carpet. Um, and you can see in the top left corner photo there, there's a US service member whose name I don't have off the top of my head, but wading through about waist-high water. And that taller photo on the right-hand side is the Torah scroll. One of the archivists who was there on site uh, talked about how he was really torn when he found this Torah scroll because it was clearly waterlogged and needed to be dried out. And so his only option was to roll it out on the ground. And he made the call that it was better to preserve it, even if it meant laying it on the ground, than let it rot and have to go to waste. Um, the US agreement with Iraq when the war started was that if they were to find culturally significant materials, that they could take temporary custody of those materials and restore them. And with this particular group of materials, they were allowed to exhibit that after the fact, and then Iraq would regain custody after the war and following the exhibition of those materials. But there was still this question, especially for many who knew the history of these materials and the archive itself, of whose actually is this, and who gets to decide where it ends up. And by the way, if I'm talking too fast, just let me know. I've gone through this a few times in different settings, so I might just be kind of running through it kind of fast. So with this controversy, we can look at the Iraqi and the Jewish perspective separately. So a representative of Iraq's prime minister asserted that the collection was Iraqi legacy owned by all of the Iraqi people and belongs to all generations. And the post-war Iraqi government maintains that they were not responsible for the previous regime's plundering of Jewish artifacts, and they should not be penalized for it. After the US invasion, many Iraqis were discussing that they needed to retain what they could of their history in order to rebuild their country. And perhaps most notably of those was Sada Skander, who is a Kurdish Iraqi, and he was the director of the Iraqi National Library and Archives, 2003 to 2015, and was arguing that the archives could help educate the Iraqi public about the country's multicultural past. Just to give a direct quote from him, he said, for Iraq to reimagine itself as a place where people of different backgrounds can live together in peace, knowledge of the past is an essential tool. On the other hand, unsurprisingly, a lot of Iraqi Jews and those advocating for them felt quite differently. Many of those records were personal items, some of them, more personal journals, as well as things like Torah scrolls. And Marie Shohet, who is an Iraqi Jew now in the US, said that every part of our history, our culture, our self-identity is there, and they, meaning the materials, should be returned to us. Further complicating this is most Iraqi Jews now live in Israel or the United States, and Israelis are not allowed to go into Iraq, and association with Israel is punishable by death in Iraq. And so there really isn't a way for Iraqis and Israelis to interact in a way that is safe. And while this material has been digitized and put online, it's only in English, though the languages of all involved parties and a lot of the materials themselves are not in English. They're in Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic and Iraqi Arabic. And a lot of the Iraqi Jews have noted that digital representations of their heritage are not necessarily sufficient. This final quote here is from Edward Rothstein, who is a museum commentator with the New York Times, and he wrote, "What evidence is there that Iraq will now treasure artifacts of Jews and other cultures? How would this archive be freely studied? Since these documents were forcefully taken from the Jews of Iraq, was the 2003 State Department agreement even valid? But if they belong to that population, who are its rightful heirs?" So yeah, my next thing is the slides with questions. So I'm going to just pause there and stop sharing my screen. And just if you wanted to ask any questions or comments on this, just before we move on, because I know this was a lot of information. But just initial thoughts so far, having run through that in 10 minutes. Comments in the chat would also be welcome if that's easier. Or if anybody's familiar with it. Yeah, Libby.
How did you get interested in this topic? And what's been your way of studying it?
Yeah, thank you. So I came at this, I'm in an English PhD program, but I've always been interested in archives and especially archives where, so backing up a little bit, my own work has worked a lot with LGBTQ history. And so the big question for me was, how do you manage things like privacy and access and balancing those questions where you have, you know, say materials that are very important to a broader public, but could be really sensitive for people who are involved in that archive or those materials. And so this is one of the case studies that I took up with my comprehensive exams, and just looking at how exactly different kind of perspectives in archives and archival studies would look at these, in this archive in particular, since I feel like the answer to me as to what to do with these materials feels obvious, but the legal answer is a whole different can of worms, and then there's several different other views as to how you actually balance those needs. Is anybody else familiar with this archive, by the way? No? Okay, I'm gonna actually take a minute to share the link then to it. And then the site that I'm also going to share, it's on the second page of a document that I will share with you all, is a protest page from Iraqi Jews. The materials have since been returned to Iraq, unfortunately, but this is the archive itself. And I'll share my screen in case anybody's on their phone and doesn't want to like toggle between, but feel free to just explore it yourself as well. Let's see. So it is through the um, National Archives and Records Administration of the United States, and the Library of Congress rules are applicable for this. So this is just the about page here, but if you go to the exhibits, they have the preservation project where they talk about what exactly they did to preserve these materials, especially since a lot of them were too fragile in order to be opened, and scanned or even examined. And they also have a page on Jewish life in Iraq, which you know, is not written by Iraqi Jews themselves. So there is that to know. Um, I think it's the browse tab. Yes, the browse page has 3,604 materials here. The search feature is very difficult to navigate, in my opinion, but a lot of these, you know, you can see where it says books or whatever, and you can look through there if you wanted to take a look through any of those materials. And it does note the language that it's in, but you'll notice that the descriptions, as I said, are all in English. I haven't, at least, I haven't gone through every single individual item, but having sorted through multiple different ways, I haven't been able to find any descriptions that are in anything other than English. Um, which is, of course, a problem if you're thinking about accessibility for the people who are in the archive or would want to access it, whether from Israel or Iraq. Not that there's nobody who speaks English there, but not usually as a first language.
Where's the archive now?
Now it's in Iraq. Yeah. I forget what year it was sent back, but despite the advocacy of Iraqi Jews and other communities, it did get sent back to Iraq. I am going to actually also send the document with my questions here, and we can still discuss other aspects of it, but just kind of have some guiding questions if that is helpful. And that will also have links on the second page, like I said, to this archive, to the protest page from Iraqi Jews, and some other potentially interesting things. So if anybody has trouble opening that link, let me know, but it should be set to comment so that you can see and comment if you want. And rather than going directly in order, if somebody wants to even just give one of the words or one of the particular questions that they'd like to start with, that was kind of how I was imagining this to go, just so that we have a little bit more choice in what order we want to go in. But if we need the direction, I can just call something out as well.
So Israel wasn't able to obtain it?
No, unfortunately not. They weren't even necessarily in the picture. It was largely a question of whether it would stay in the US or go back to Iraq because of the agreement with the State Department. Though there is a lot of Iraqi Jews also are called Babylonian Jews, because that's the name of the land that they had gone to when they went there. And the Babylonian Jewish Heritage Center is in Israel. And so there was an argument that it should go there, but it didn't end up making it there, obviously. And I see the question in the comments here. I'm not exactly sure. The last update that I've seen, the comment was asking if the materials are actively being displayed or made physically accessible in Iraq. The last update that I saw was just that they were sent back to Iraq. I don't speak Arabic, and so if there's updates in Arabic, I haven't been able to read them. But I can definitely find that out for you by taking another look. The last I was looking at this was a couple of months ago, and I might just not have seen it. Do folks want to dive into any of the discussion questions or any of the particular areas? I have them organized into 4 different areas, based off of Hebrew words that I felt like were kind of resonant in terms of the issues that come up when thinking about this archive and the ethical questions that come up with it. So Zachor, which is to remember or cause to be remembered, Zedek, justice and righteousness, Shamar, to guard or protect, and Shoresh, which is root or source, like an origin point. And there's 2 questions with each. Anybody want to take up any of them in particular? Oh, so that link should have the questions. I'm also just going to put them in the chat if that's easier. I can only put them in 2 separate things, I think, because of word limits. So there's 1 set, and then it's 59 words over for the second set. So I'm gonna have to do this in 3 messages, actually. There you go. Sorry about that. Somehow I got muted. I just shared the questions on my screen as well, if that makes it easier. But if anybody wants to just either name one of the words, or if there's a particular question that is standing out to you that you'd like to discuss. Otherwise, I'll just throw one at us in a minute here. To Libby's question, is there any way to know if the archive is being preserved? I can imagine them being back in a flooded basement. I suppose it'd be depending on how honest you feel the Iraqi government could be about that. And so there is, of course, that question. And actually, that is similar to one of the questions that I have on here under Shamar, which is to guard or protect. So that third block of questions. The second question there says, can a state be trusted with the preservation of history, especially when that history includes the state's own actions that may have been destructive or harmful to a particular group? And I'll put that specific one in the chat. Libby, since you asked that question, do you want to speak on that one at all? I think you're still unmuted if you wanted to just jump in.
Well, I'm pretty cynical about it, obviously.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that the only way to really to preserve it would be to remove it to Israel, and that sounds like that's not an option. But the archives of a people where to have any contact with the remaining Iraqi Jews is, or to have any contact with Israel is punishable by death, does not make me optimistic that there's any particular interest in preserving these things. And I feel kind of horrified about the whole thing and disappointed that the US gave them back.
Yeah. Yeah, and I will say that that's unfortunately one of the things that comes out of international law as well, is that you know, the US having just been in a legally questionable in terms of international law war with Iraq,
Right.
and then having to follow international law to give it back. It's like you couldn't have broken one more law and just given it to Israel. But at the but at the same time, it does place them in a really particularly difficult situation. Any other thoughts on this? How would it feel, maybe also thinking about if Iraq didn't have the law that contact with Israel was punishable by death? Would that change your mind about it going to Iraq, or would it still feel like that was the wrong decision?
I think it would change my mind somewhat. I've just come back from a trip to Morocco where Jews were treated quite differently. And I think if it were there, I would have a different feeling about it. But I don't know, and I'm only learning about this now, so I wouldn't feel that I, had any particular knowledge other than my blatant cynicism.
Apologies, just got in, had a hard time getting in. Just a couple quick clarifying questions. How many
Sure.
Iraqi Jews still left? Where are most of them based? How do they feel?
Yeah, so go ahead, sorry.
When did we give back these documents? Under whose administration?
So let me double check for you the specific year that it went back. Let's see, Jewish Archive. I do know, though, that there was a limited timeline as to when they were actually, required to give it back. It looks like it was determined that they would be going back in 2017. That's from the Times of Israel. And that there was another post from the Jerusalem Post actually saying that it still needs to be returned to Iraqi Jews. But then the news on this is very up in the air, and it looks like, I believe as of 2022 it was headed back to Iraq. One of the links there that I have, the third one in the relevant links on I sent a document. I'm going to reshare that actually. The Iraqi Jews website protesting the return of the archive, I don't believe has been updated in quite a while, but that will be where I would go for the most updated information. But as to where Iraqi Jews are today, there's a good split between the US and Israel, as there is with a lot of other Jewish communities, of course, but primarily, I believe in Israel, though California has quite a sizable population. As for in Iraq, outside of the region of Kurdistan, there's, I think, something like 4 Jews left, at least openly Jewish in Iraq. The Kurdistan region has a few hundred at most, mostly because the Kurdistan region is a lot more open and is, of course, has long wanted to be separate from the rest of Iraq. So their laws are a little bit different and their culture's a bit different. This is also my first time presenting this to other Jews, and so I feel like your questions are pressing me in a way that I was not used to from other groups. So I appreciate that.
I was a history major in college, and these are just, in the social sciences, just what comes to mind. Like, and also, it's interesting that agreed to go back, what's his name administration went back to Biden administration. So it's, yeah, surprised that Biden didn't or wasn't able to listen to an ear. And, if we're not signatories in The Hague, how much international law do, in terms of that kind of court of law, or would this even come up in that kind of court of law? So those are all the thoughts that are running through my brain.
Yeah, and I will say the Society of American Archivists, just for those who are more historically minded, they do have a write-up on the different international agreements that the State Department had entered into during the Iraq War, and they have a specific section on the Iraqi Jewish Archive. The Society of American Archivists was strongly in favor of sending it back to Iraq because of international law. I am with you. I don't, well, with those of you who have spoken so far, that I don't really trust it going back to Iraq. Even if there were not those laws in place about relations with Israel being punishable by death, it just feels to me that if the community is largely not there anymore, what's the point? If they don't want to send it back there, because I think one of your other questions was, how do Iraqi Jews feel about this? And there's, I don't know how many different community groups for Iraqi Jews, but none of them seem to be in agreement about it going specifically to Iraq. The debate seems to be more about, does it stay with the US or go to Israel? The US being the preferred option, generally speaking, just because that would mean that Iraqis could theoretically go and visit that archive as well, because there's not the same laws in place for going and visiting the US. I mean, it might be treated with more suspicion, but it's not the same as going to Israel.
One last quick thought. I just
Yeah.
wonder, like, does the UN have some sort of a caretakership for this, so that, like, one could literally go to, an office within the UN and find, disputed archives or archives that can't go back to the nation of origin for whatever reason?
I don't believe the UN has anything like that, but that would be interesting. I'm not sure if they would do that. I have my own cynicisms about the UN when it comes to anything with Jews in Israel, I will say. And so I'm not sure if that would even work necessarily in this case, but it is an interesting thought, even just having something where it is more international ground.
And I hear you on the UN, and that can be like more like voting blocks versus like the actual functionaries who work
Right.
at the UN, who would be, a little bit more hopefully blindsided on that kind of politics.
Yeah. Yeah. I do want to point to some of the questions in other sections just to kind of get us thinking a little bit more abstract, perhaps, if that's all right. Not to kind of shut down the conversation about the archive specifically, but going up to the questions in Zahor, there are 2 there. The first one is, what is at stake when memory is curated by those outside the community? And whether we're thinking about this, or, for example, if you're in the US, Native American artifacts being held by the US government, especially for those where the community might be small and maybe doesn't have a federally recognized tribe or very few members still living. But even in the case of, say, like the Cherokee Nation, which is alive and well and thriving in many respects, but not all of their materials are held by the Cherokee Nation. So thinking about that question, which again is just what's at stake when memory is curated by those outside the community. I'll also throw in the second question there, which was, what does it mean to preserve our own history when others have written it for us or tried to erase it entirely? How can we reclaim it, and should we always try to? Which I think is particularly relevant, also thinking about Israel and how it is discussed in, popular conversations, just speaking of the UN, versus what we might understand or think we understand about that history. I want to make sure I'm not missing the chat too. You can use the raise hand feature or raise your physical hand, though I can't see everybody, so.
I do have some thoughts on the first one, but I'd love it if somebody else speaks for a while and then I'll go after.
Yeah, don't make Libby and Ellen do all the talking.
Maybe we're just the ones who had like a 3 or 4 hour nap just now so we could see.
I see Judy unmuted.
I think the United Nations has some laws about this, don't they?
Yeah, though it's what I'm no international law expert, but what I've seen has largely been about because Jews are not a recognized indigenous people by the United Nations, our history is not treated in the way that those groups are, and they don't really have much in terms of diaspora in the way that Jews are a diaspora. So it seems to me, based off of my own reading, which again, I'm no international law expert, and if somebody is, please correct me if I'm wrong, that the international law seems to point to it going back to Iraq because that's where it came from, even though it wasn't made by Iraqis in the sense that we would think of Iraqis, if that makes sense.
So I think in the US with indigenous nations, it's really fraught in terms of quote unquote federal recognition. Being here in Massachusetts, I'm on the land of traditional Massachusetts land, and in the past 400 years of the praying Indians of Natick, Ponkapog, and Neshoba, of whom I know many people in that nation or tribal group, as they call themselves. And it's very, very fraught because what ends up happening is that if there is a group who has federal recognition, so once again, indigenous people having to go to the white colonial European government that nearly destroyed their cultures to get recognition of who they are, who they've always known to be. And then there's like state recognition. So Abenaki up in Vermont had that, and then and then Trump comes in and just in one stupid magic marker move, destroys the Wampanoag. I think federal recognition at one point, and there's been a lot of discussion and argument and disagreement because what ends up happening is that people who are Nipmuc and Massachusetts and NPI, what is traditionally understood to be theirs ends up going to another group for in NAGPRA, like to determine like whose cultural stuff it is. And it's watching from the outside perspective, it looks absurd, and I can only imagine what the pain is like specifically on the inside. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Does anybody else want to jump in either on the thoughts that were just shared or in any of these questions, specifically the two that I had called out from the Zahor section? Sure, I'll copy and paste these again. I must say I have mixed feelings about this not being like one of my college classrooms where I can just point to somebody and make you talk. Jean.
I think that you can always there are always well-meaning people who wish to tell the truth about something that was, something that happened. And they don't mean to present it in a patronizing way or from an ownership standpoint. But I think and those people are, I think what we've currently decided to refer to as allies, as opposed to, sort of members of the group. But I think members of groups have the right to, and probably should, try to reclaim their heritage if even some of them are around. I mean, if you're still a living group, if somebody else is curating your heritage, then you're a dead group. You're not an active, alive group.
Thank you for that. And I will say that what you were saying reminded me of one of the other questions that I have on here is asking about the Jews from other communities, so those who are not from Iraqi Jewish background, but say, from another Middle Eastern nation or a North African nation or from European Jewry or Chinese Jewry. Do we get a say in what this should look like for Iraqi Jews because we're also Jews, or does it have to remain particular to Iraqi Jews? Because I think that's also a question here too, is who of Jews gets a say in what happens?
We certainly have a secondary, I would
Yeah.
think. And we certainly have a secondary claim in that, Jewish, if you're going to say something is Jewish and they're members of the Jewish people and we're Jewish people, then it's something in our shared culture, certainly. But I think the Iraqi Jews should try to reclaim this material to go someplace where they can have access to it on a for reals basis. And so could others. I mean, how many people, anybody who wants to go to Iraq, see this stuff?
I saw, I don't want to call out one person, but I saw one person make quite a face. Do you want to jump in and say anything if you know who you are? No?
I mean, it's not, I wouldn't feel safe going there. It's not that I think there's something wrong with Iraq. That's not the issue. I mean, they have they have their thing, we have our thing. But I would not feel, that I could go do any research in this archive or that I could go see it. Or if I had Iraqi relatives that I could go look them up the way people are constantly running off to Europe to look up their relatives.
Right. Yeah, no, and that's a good point. And I wasn't meaning to kind of like shut down what you were saying, but just as another kind of twist in all of this. And I think that it is also, since there are still people who are of Iraqi Jewish heritage, it seems.
And it's not a small community.
Right. No, it's not. I forget how many there are now, but it's, you say not a small community, and then remembering that we're like, what is it, 0.1% of the world population is Jews. But I think there's a few 100,000 Iraqi Jews, from what I recall.
Well, that's a lot of people.
Yeah, especially relative to the, for Jewish communities, it's a lot of people. For the world population, they seem to be like, that's small.
All the archives are online, are you saying?
Yes, and that I will share the link again. Though that is also in the Google Doc file that I put there. But yes, there's the link again.
Okay.
If anybody has been looking through the archive, or even if there's just another question that we haven't discussed, since we only have about, I think about 10 minutes left or so. I don't know, it's 50 minutes or an hour. But since we're on the end portion, relatively speaking. Especially for those of you who haven't said anything yet. Are there things that you are noticing about the archive or questions that you wanted to discuss?
Oh, I have another question.
Yeah,
Are you calling on me?
yeah, go ahead.
Raising my hand.
Yes.
I see. There I am, with my hand all raised. Is this material available? It will ever be made available? Do you think on Safaria?
I don't know enough about Safaria to say whether or not that would.
I mean, it certainly seems like it would be up their alley.
It's something that you could definitely send them a message if you know how to get in contact with them. I don't know if Iraqi Jews have sought that out in particular though. But I know that, the materials are online, so
Right, so they're already there. Maybe just
yeah,
the link even would be,
yeah.
because that's a place where people go to discover material.
Mhm. Do others have things that they want to discuss with this or discussion questions that they wanted to talk through? Anything at all? Or maybe I shouldn't be so open-ended. What is something that is still standing out for you about this archive that we haven't discussed yet, if that makes the question a little bit more pointed here?
So I just went to the archive page, and
Mhm.
at first I thought, oh my God, this is actually in Iraq. And then I realized it's just, I'm assuming just a general archive page. So I'm kind of wondering like how you pull out things that were actually in Iraq. Do you have to put something into the search bar or something, or?
So this would be sent as a collection back to Iraq. But all 3,604 materials here on the Iraqi Jewish Archive page would be sent back as a unit. Um,
Oh, okay. So this so the first one that strikes me is something on the Kabbalah.
yeah.
Mm. And so because there's, no publication date and things like that. So like, I'm assuming this came about, you know, in the past few hundred years as opposed to like 1,000 years old. And so how does one, so how did this get to Iraq is, that's what jumps into my mind.
Yeah, and I think that's a question that we don't necessarily know the answer to, though I will say that, let's see if I can find it in the search here, or even just sorting, but I know that there are materials on, say, like, on Israel, on Zionism, things that they were not supposed to have information about. So let's see.
I mean, like the one to the right there, it was like published in Vienna. So I'm like, so how did that make its way to an Iraqi collection?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that, they're still sending things, though, there's even something in Arabic here from the PLO,
Yeah.
which is a surprise, in a way, but also, they have a number of different things. I just searched Israel and there's 154 materials that are coming up, with Israel tagged there. Not all of it is directly related to the Israeli government. A lot of it is, okay, so there's Israeli cities. Some of these things are more about Zionism generally. There's a history of Zionism here. But yeah, and then actually a modern Israeli textbook is one of these here as well.
So
So I
how much?
imagine that some of this is probably smuggled in as well.
Yeah. And how old are some of and also, I mean, let's go back to a time in Iraq where, you know, there was widespread education for young women, and it was a very different country as was Iran. Um, how like some of the more ancient texts, like how old are some of those? That's what's really curious to me.
Yeah, and I think that's a good question. I know that they probably mentioned somewhere in the preservation project probably has some information about that in terms of how old some of these materials were, but it's also hard to date some of them when they have a lot of water damage, just because that is going to change how they age. I don't recall off the top of my head how old or how far back some of those went. Though certainly a few hundred years at least.
But nothing like 2,000-year-old scrolls kind of thing.
Not that I recall off the top of my head, but if somebody wants to do some searching and see if they can find that, and then just kind of put it in the chat or shout it out, that would be helpful, but no pressure. Also, be honest, are the questions just not interesting compared to the archive itself? Because we could just spend time looking at the archive. Somebody be brutally honest here for our
Okay.
last 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Interesting, and the archive is interesting. I have energy. I think a lot of folks might not, but I would love to hear people speak up a little bit.
Yeah, there's no stupid question or stupid comment here because this is unfamiliar to a lot of people. So you don't have to have some special insight here.
According to just a search of the oldest materials, it says that the oldest book in the collection is from 1399, the second of 4 volumes of the Hebrew Bible. Oh, no, sorry, 1524 by Daniel Bomberg, and is the oldest book in the collection. It is known as the Second Great Rabbinic Bible.
Wow.
I just put oldest material in the search bar, and this is what came up.
Let's see. And is it okay? So I'm seeing 1399.
It says the volume is incomplete. It includes the books of Joshua, Judges, and First and Second Samuel, through chapter 5. It's missing First and Second Kings, and then there's commentaries by Rashi, Radak, and Levi Ben Gershon, and an Aramaic translation of the text. Huh.
Would you mind linking
Doesn't
that
sound
if
like
you
things go back any farther than that. So
are you able to link that in the chat?
I have no idea how to do that.
It's okay. What about the identifier number? It should say like in
1399.
okay.
Nevi'im Rishonim underneath it.
Is this it? Second of 4 volumes of the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Okay.
it.
I'll put the link in the chat for people if anybody wants to take a look at this.
There's also an interesting picture of if you look on the traveling exhibitions of them trying to dry the books after they were wet, like literally on the ground out in the sun. Quite something. I'm gonna put that image in the chat.
Yeah, and that's one of the images that I had in the slides there. And if you even Google, just since I have my screen shared, if you search Iraqi Jewish Archive, some of the photos from the National Archives in particular. So there's, sorry, I have my screen weirdly shaped here. But some of the books just kind of jammed into a suitcase or some sort of, container of some kind. But there's also plenty of photos of those books laying out to dry, including, as one I showed earlier was a Torah scroll rolled out on the ground to dry. And for those who came in late, actually, I think it was this man here with the headlamp in this image. I believe it was him who is, he's Jewish, and he was torn about spreading out the Torah scroll on the ground to dry it, but also knew that it needed to be dried. And so, given the choice of letting it rot or rolling it out on the ground, it seemed like rolling it out on the ground was the right decision to him. Yeah, there's that image there.
These people are always like, it's, you hear about this happening so much during war, and to me, it's always like a group of unsung librarians and archivists and historians and lover of preserving the past. And it's astounding. I mean, I think what is that well-known book? It's a fiction, but it's based on a lot of about former Yugoslavia, the Haggadah that was.
You're talking about the Sarajevo Haggadah and Geraldine Brooks's book, The People of the Book.
Yeah.
It's a fictionalized account of how that Haggadah was saved. And the actual story of how it was saved in World War II is one of the most astonishing stories you'll ever read. There's a New Yorker article about it some years ago. But it was saved in Sarajevo from the Nazis by the Muslim curator of the historical museum, who took it home in his pants pocket and gave it to his wife and told her to hide it. And it goes on from there.
There's actually, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say Geraldine Brooks's book is really fun and interesting, but the actual story of what happened is even better.
There's a website that I don't know off the top of my head, but I know that it's mentioned in Dara Horn's book, People Love Dead Jews. She mentions in one particular chapter that there's Jewish heritage sites that you can find online that have been preserved in part by people who go in to these sites and sometimes have to have decoy cameras and things like that in order to record these sites before they're totally destroyed. I will just say, since we're running out of time here, that one thing that I'm going to share here is I just put the link in the chat to my references page from when I presented this in a separate context, but it has a lot of the same sorts of information if you're interested. And if there are any resources that you can't get access to, my email is at the top there, and you can just send me an email that you would like to get access, but you don't have access. And then I'm just going to share one more time the questions document that has some other links if anybody is interested. I wish we could discuss this a little bit more, but I know that we have to let other folks have their chance. But thank you for the time and engaging with this. And please don't let this be the last you discuss the Iraqi Jewish Archive. I think it's important, especially for those of us who are in non-Mizrahi communities, to just make sure that their history is being heard, not just at this time, but in general, since the focus, especially in the US, has been so much on Ashkenazi heritage that we could definitely spread around the love. So, any final thoughts? No? All right, thank you.
Thank you for bringing this to us, and I'm assuming it's going to be a passion of yours for quite some time.
I hope so. I'm considering just going and doing archives instead of English, but I'm already 2 years, almost 3 years into this PhD. It seems like it would be something to. It'd be a little bit difficult.
I hope you get a chance to reach out to Iraqi Jewish Americans and maybe some in the UK and Israel and really be a great ally there.
Thank you. And obviously you can also feel free to reach out to them. So don't let me be the one person. So